So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this week's Qesher Book Club event. My name is Dora. I'm one of the organizers of Qesher. I see a lot of familiar faces. Thank you so much for joining us again. And I also am happy to welcome all of you who are joining us for the first time. Just for you, I want to say a few words about Qesher. This is an initiative that we started almost 4 years ago now, and our main topics and themes go around introducing Jewish communities from all over the world. We introduce history, culture, heritage in Zoom sessions, and I know many of you have attended these kind of sessions. And just a few months ago, we started a new series in which we introduce authors and their books. And of course, when we introduce authors and their books, we also they are very much connected to the general theme that we work with. So all of the books that we share with you are books that are related to Jewish history in different places. So this is exactly what we're going to do today as well. We're going to hear about the book, The Sephardi Turkish Patriot, and we are very happy to welcome Anthony Gadbigio, who is the author, who is here with us today, who is going to share with us about this wonderful book. He was born in Italy to a British father and a Turkish mother, both from Sephardi descent. And he has a lot of other stories in his biography, which I'm going to let him introduce. And I'm just going to pass the word to Anthony now. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And at the end of the presentation, in about 45 minutes from now, we will have time for Q&A. So Anthony, the stage is all yours.
Great, Dora. Thank you very much. And thank you and Sebastian for having me here. I'm delighted to be part of the Qesher Book Club. And also thanks to Drora Arusi, whom I know is supporting today's initiative. So the book I'm going to talk to you about is the Sephardi Turkish Patriot. And in fact, it's the historical biography of my maternal grandfather, Gad Franco, who was a journalist, then a lawyer and a jurist, and a prominent representative of Turkish Jewry for about half a century, and very active in the first half of the 20th century, which coincides with the first 2 decades of with the last 2 decades of the Ottoman Empire and the first 3 decades of the Turkish Republic. In fact, although it is a biography, I think that the book, as you will hear from me in a minute, and you will see if you read it, really covers pretty much the history of the Jewish people in Turkey from their arrival from Spain in 1492 all the way up to their massive exile to Palestine and then Israel in the mid-20th century. And the book is also really about Gad's vision for an inclusive secular society where all citizens, all minorities could be equally accepted as full-fledged citizens. A vision which I think is still of great relevance today in many parts of the world where, unfortunately, that is not the case. And this is why I want to insist really on those aspects of the book as we go ahead. In fact, this vision in Turkey did not pan out, as we know. What happened instead is sort of a repressive autocratic regime that came into being, and with ethno-nationalism as the driving force. So this is the book I'm going to tell you about. But first, I wanted to, say a few things about me, as Dora has started introducing me, just to give you a sense of where I come from, why I got to write this book, what this book means to me, and hopefully how these different strands of Sephardic identity that are now scattered around all the world can at times get together. And thanks to initiatives like Qesher, of course, that makes this kind of interaction possible. So I'm connecting to you from Washington, D.C. I've been living here for 30 years now. For 20, I was a full-time staff member of the World Bank doing international work. I'm an architect and urban planner by trade. So my work had to do with cities around the world, When I retired from the World Bank, I started teaching grad school here at George Washington University, Sustainable Urban Planning. And now I'm still active professionally as an advisor to some international agencies in my field of work. My background is pretty complex. My father was a British journalist. He was born in Southport on the British coast. His family was a Sephardic family from Manchester, but they were originally from Aleppo. And in fact, this connection to the Middle East came back pretty quickly in my father's life. They moved back to first France, then Egypt, where he grew up, then became a journalist, covered the Second World War. And then as a war correspondent, also covered the Israeli War of Independence in 1948. My mother's side, obviously, she was Gad Franco's daughter, right? And grew up first in Izmir and then in Istanbul, as you'll hear in a minute when we talk about him. She studied in Paris at the Sorbonne for her college education, then married my grandfather during the Second World War, moved to Cairo to live with him. And then after the war, they decided to settle in Italy, which is where I was born. So this is probably a fairly typical trajectory of many of us, many of our families, where multiple cultures, multiple countries are layered in the kind of heritage we bring with us. And my personal ties to Turkey growing up were frankly very, very marginal, because my mother, who had really suffered a lot of traumas through what happened to her own father and her own experience of living there as a young person, really had a very hard time going back and refused to go back for a long time. So while I did go as a teenager with a family, my connecting to the story of Gad Franco really started in my 20s, as I first visited the town where he was born and bumped into people who still remembered him. And that evoked a lot of curiosity in my mind. But it really kind of bloomed in the last 10, 12 years when I really decided that I had to dig into his story and to bring it to life. And, I'm also Gad Franco's only grandchild. And so I think it was a mixture of a sense of curiosity, fascination for that world that I always heard about and with which I had ultimately little connection growing up, but also a sense of duty, right, of discovering such an important figure, such a person with very powerful messages that he had pursued all his life and for which he paid very dearly. And I felt it was really something that was my responsibility to pull together, right? And hence this book, without which I think probably his story would have been a little bit lost, like so many other stories. So I will present Gad's biography in the context of his times, but also trying to highlight some key themes. And I will kind of call them out as I speak to make sure that, you kind of focus on them as well. And perhaps we can go back to them in the questions and answer session, because I think that there are themes that are, pretty relevant, some of which are still very meaningful today, and that I hope will kind of resonate with you and also give you a desire to read this book. So Gad Franco was born in Milas, which is a small town close to the Asia Minor coast, in 1881, into a lineage of Sephardic rabbis. His father was a rabbi, his grandfather was a rabbi, and in fact, his uncle, Moshe Judah, who was living in Rhodes at the time, was also a rabbi and eventually became the chief Sephardic rabbi of Palestine later on in his life.
Excuse me, could you speak a little slowly? You're going fast. Thank you.
Of course, with pleasure. So, and let me see if I can, I just want to be able to, okay, yeah, all good here. Right, so I'm saying he was sent to Rhodes because one of his sisters was married off to a cousin, and the family decided to send on Gad as a child when he was 6 to Rhodes to study. And he was immediately taught in Turkish and French as well as Hebrew. And this is quite an extraordinary event for the time in educational terms, because otherwise, had Gad stayed back in Milas, in his hometown, he would have been simply taught at the local Talmud Torah, just learning the sacred texts, learning the Hebrew language, and not much else. Instead of which, through Turkish and through learning French, he was exposed to cultures that were of great importance to him and to the whole Jewish community. He stayed there throughout high school, came back from high school, and went off to teach at the Jewish school in Milas, of which he also became the director. And he also became a member of the Juventud Union, which was the local voluntary association of young people in the city of Milas. Let me show you a couple of photos just to give a little bit of flavor to our conversation. So here is Milas on the Aegean coast. You can see quite clearly. We are close to the islands. Here's the island of Rhodes. Here is Crete. Here is Greece. And of course, here is Istanbul. And then here is the Juventud Union, this group of Jewish young men, all perfectly dressed, who were actually managing the community and managing the school. And Gad is right here. He's the youngest and the shortest, and but obviously one of the bright kids who was very enthusiastic about what they were doing at the time. And there he was teaching in these languages, French and Turkish, which were still quite unknown to the community. So this is theme number one. And so please remember this one, which is one of language and education. So I've mentioned Hebrew, of course, I've mentioned Turkish and French, but haven't mentioned Ladino. So Ladino was obviously the language that the Sephardic community spoke even 400 years after the exile. And while it was something which was rich in heritage and in memories and that conveyed the distant past, conveyed the exile and the traditions that Jews had in Sepharad, in a way it was also isolating the Jewish community from its surroundings. So the Jewish community was very self-sufficient, very self-centered in a way. Its activities, be they commercial or cultural, were all inward-looking. The community was held together by the rabbis, by the religious laws and the practice of religious laws. The schools, as I said before, were also limited to the male members of the community, to the boys who would go to the Talmud Torah and learn the sacred language and not much else. So this changed at the time of Gad's youth, and it changed primarily with the arrival of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. This was a French organization, benevolent organization put together by French Jews that had experienced emancipation in their country and that were working very actively to promote access to education, culture, modern scientific thinking, and did an extraordinary work of creating a whole network of schools across the Arab world, and Turkey included, of course. From Persia all the way to Morocco, these schools were opened and little by little embraced by the Jewish communities that were extremely enthusiastic at this opportunity that was given to them. And so there was a big shift going on, really a move from Ladino, which was the language still spoken at home, to French. And through French, the opportunity obviously to connect to a whole world of ideas, of literature, of books, and exposure to connections with Europe that had been severed hundreds of years before, right? But what about Turkish? Turkish was not spoken by Ottoman Jews, by the Sephardic Jews of Turkey. And this is something which is obviously holding them back, holding the whole community back from being able to play a bigger role in the society that surrounded them. And Gad, having had this opportunity of this education up front, having been taught in French and in Turkish, was really the perfect conduit to build bridges between his own community and the broader Ottoman polity. So in that sense, he was quite an exception. I'm trying to retrieve. Sorry, Dora, I have a big image of you, which I'm going to close. Right. So Dora, maybe you can help me. I've kind of lost. Here it is. Here it is. Share screen again. So here we are. He was there. So this is Smyrna, where Gad moved to when he was 20 to become a journalist. And here is Gad at his desk as a young journalist. He was writing for Ladino newspapers. He was writing in Ladino, of course, in Turkish, in French, and was very active in promoting really the modernization of the Jewish community, which, as I was saying, was pretty much cut off from the broader Ottoman polity. Gad also supported the Young Turk Revolution when that took place in 1909 and the return of the constitutional regime that had been cut off for 30 years. And there was this brief period called Ottomanism, when profound reforms introduced by the Young Turk government really enabled all minorities to become full-fledged citizens. And this was a huge opportunity, which Gad embraced. He was himself a member of the party that was behind the Young Turk Revolution. He became a lawyer in 1909 after having self-educated in the law and brilliantly passing the bar exam. He married, in fact, in 1910, the daughter of David Fresco, who was the editor of the daily El Tiempo, which is the most prominent Ladino newspaper of the time that was published for about 50 years. And by marrying into that family, kind of connected to the upper crust of the Sephardic intelligentsia of Istanbul, and really became a very well-known spokesperson of the Jewish community of Izmir. So let me show you a few more photos here. Let's see. So here is Gad in 1910 as an established lawyer, when his writings, his points of view were very much appreciated. There was a lot of communication back and forth between Izmir and Istanbul, of course, on the matters of the day, the government, the future of the country, these reforms. And Gad was constantly pushing for the Jewish community to somehow go beyond its boundaries and play a more active role in politics. Here is David Fresco, the editor of El Tiempo, and his father-in-law, about 1930, so later on. But this gentleman was extremely influential. His newspaper was sent all around the Ottoman Empire and even into Europe. So he was really a critical thinker and somebody who imported ideas of the Enlightenment into the Ottoman Empire for the benefit of the Jewish community, of course. And oops, that comes later. All right, so let's get back to the story. So Ottomanism. Ottomanism was really an opportunity that was offered not only to the Jews, but also to all the other minorities of the empire, the Arabs, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, to really come into the polity in a much more structured way than they had before. You know, in previous imperial times, these communities all had their own institutions, jurisdiction over their own communal affairs, and so on. So this is really the time for them to integrate. And we should not forget that the Alliance Israélite was very much in favor of the Jewish community assimilating into the Turkish polity, right? Following the example of what had happened in Europe, and particularly in France, where obviously after the French Revolution and Napoleonic times, Jews were given full access to human rights and civil rights and maintained their own religious institutions, but first and foremost became citizens of the Republic. And this is what the Alliance Israélite Universelle was, of course, promoting among the Jews of Turkey. So another big theme that you'll see if you read the book and that I want to touch upon is the one of Zionism and anti-Zionism. That was, of great relevance at that time. So, of course, the Zionist movement was extremely interested in the Ottoman Empire because Palestine was an Ottoman province. So Herzl approached the Sultan as of 1896 to try to see the way of establishing some agreements so as to have Jewish prerogatives over the province, and tried also with the support of the German Kaiser, who also thought that the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine was a good one, but ultimately the Sultan refused. There was already bits and pieces of the empire that were being lost through all sorts of conflicts and decolonization, as it were, that was taking place at the time. We don't have time to get into the details, but obviously the Zionist organization not only approached the Sultan and his court trying to make these agreements, but also tried to promote the idea of Zionism among the Turkish Jewish community through publications, through contacts, through all sorts of moments of promotion of this plan, right? Which, as we know, was obviously originating in Central and Eastern Europe. And that's where a bunch of intellectuals, including David Fresco and Gad Franco, rose in opposition to Zionism. And there was a big clash of ideals, if you will, at the time between the Zionists that were proposing the creation of a Jewish homeland and the Turkish Jewish intellectuals that were saying, no, we want to be citizens of this country, we want to be fully integrated, and we don't want to be perceived by our Turkish co-citizens as potentially traitors. And you have to put this in the context of the time where the other minorities, especially the Armenians and the Greeks, were fighting very hard, not so much to integrate the empire as opposed to carve out pieces of the territory for themselves. So the Jews were extremely concerned that they may be perceived by the Muslim majority as if that's what they wanted to do, right? And so there was a fundamental rejection of Zionism. It was a fairly established anti-Zionist intellectual movement to which Gad adhered and for which he wrote extensively articles and pamphlets and so on, as well as his father-in-law, David Fresco. And I want to just read, as this is such a controversial theme, if you will, as we look back at those times, just want to read one paragraph from my book where I say, at stake were two opposing visions of Judaism's future. For David Fresco, Jewish spiritual, intellectual, and ethical values, creativity, and its potential to innovate could really blossom in the countries where Jews live. Judaism could be a successful component of democratic, cosmopolitan societies that allowed and appreciated diversity. The opposite, muscular Judaism, as Zionist leader Max Nordau had defined it in 1898, was based on the steadfast determination that the security and survival of the Jewish people would not be at the mercy of other nations, that only by developing their own institutions in a fully Jewish homeland and society could Jews manage present threats and determine their collective future. And I say tensions between these two visions would persist for much longer and would shape and be shaped by the tragic events of the 20th century. So that's on the theme of Zionism that I wanted to tell you about. And then, of course, what happened was that the wars broke out, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, but ultimately it was the end of the Ottoman Empire very soon, and the Zionist movement lost interest in dialogue with the Sultan. The Sultan lost control and eventually lost all those provinces, right, of Palestine, Syria, and so on and so forth. And so rather, as we know, the Zionist movement started building a diplomatic relationship with the British Empire instead. So as I said, and I'll go quickly through this part of the book, although it is an interesting one, a decade of wars ensued, unfortunately, bringing down this whole vision of Ottomanism and this opportunity of building a constitutional polity where there was room for everybody to be citizens. First, we had the Italo-Turkish War, centered in Libya, then the Balkan Wars, 1912, 1913, and then finally the First World War exploded, and with that, all the horrors and massacres that we know, including the Armenian genocide of 1915. Gad was still in Smyrna at the time, living there with his family. He had married, as we know, and had kids, was practicing as a lawyer, was the president of the lay council of the Jewish community of Izmir. He was in touch with international relief organizations, Jewish relief organizations that were helping communities in distress like his own. And then here we are with another big theme of the book, which is the one of the Sephardic diaspora. What happened at that point as the empire started imploding and all these wars were tearing it apart? The reaction of Sephardic Ottoman Jews was primarily one of running away, of leaving the country, of trying to find salvation elsewhere, destinies that could have been better for them elsewhere. So a full half of Turkish, of Ottoman Jews left in that decade before the First World War and during and after the First World War. Let's say between roughly 1910 and 1920, about 100,000 Jews left. Where did they go? Of course, they went to France, because by then those that had learned French had a conduit and a connection and actually a refugee status that was granted to them in France. They went to the US, of course, and we have here in the US large communities that are originally from those people. And then when the US started clamping down on immigration in 1924, then they started mostly going to Central and Latin America. And that's where the Ladino was of extreme use, because they could ultimately speak the language of the country, and through the diaspora networks and support systems that were there, obviously they could connect and rebuild a life for themselves. That's what happened. So that moment of explosion of the Jewish diaspora from the Ottoman Empire, that's when and how it happened. In the case of Gad, so he was still in Izmir, in Smyrna. Smyrna was attacked by the Greeks, who tried to occupy it with both British and French support, and took over the city, started going further and further inland. And it was really the ruin, the end of the empire, as it looked like. And Gad finally decided to leave. He stuck it out for a little bit. Then he also took off and went off to Paris in exile, as it were. Here is one photo of him in a public park with his children and his wife and a maid, as I had just settled there. And on the back of this photo, he wrote to his parents, who were still in Milas, saying, "All is well, we're here, we love you, don't worry about us," and so on and so forth. so Gad stayed there for 2 years in Paris, and so did his brother, and of course, lots of other Jews from Smyrna and elsewhere. But then he took an incredible decision, which was really the turning point in his life. He was hearing that, in fact, back in his country, back in Turkey, there was a general that was resurrecting the pride of the Turkish army and pushing back against the invaders, against the Turks and the Brits and the French. And that was Mustafa Kemal, the future Atatürk, who was a hero of the First World War. And he, this gentleman, this general, brilliantly was able to regain control, at least of the core of the empire, which was Turkey itself, pretty much in the shape and borders as we know the country today. And Gad felt that he had a patriotic duty to go back. And while his brother and also his cousins and other people, they all stayed in France or the States or Latin America and so on, he felt that the birth, well, it wasn't yet the Republic, right? But this regain of control of the national territory and the intentions of this emerging new government was something that resonated enormously with him. He said, I'm a man of law, and here in Paris studying international law, practicing as a lawyer, I need to bring my skills back to my country. And this is a very controversial and pretty unique decision that he took. Controversial also because his wife didn't want to hear about it. His wife was perfectly happy living in Paris. They all spoke French. The kids were going to school. Everything looked pretty good. Why go back to a country in turmoil and in conflict? But Gad said, no, we have to go back. And he did. They did. In fact, he moved the family back, of course, with him. And so for about 2 decades, between when he was 30, when he was 40 until when he was 60, those 2 decades there, he established himself in Istanbul and had a very successful life. First as a constitutional scholar with a doctorate from the Sorbonne, which he got in 1925, while the Republic was created, right in 1923. He created a journal of juridical studies, which was a fully independent, self-financed scientific publication through which he really built a bridge between the European and the Turkish legal worlds, and which is something that gave him enormous respect and credibility in Turkey. He also had a successful law practice, became a very wealthy, well-established lawyer, and third, he was a prominent representative and spokesperson for the Jewish community of Istanbul, defending its interests and institutions at critical junctures with the government, which we'll talk more in a minute. But through all of this, and again, this is really about him, his vision was one of Western liberalism, defending the rule of law against any kind of abuses, the culture, the modernization of the country, which was way overdue, and also the acceptance of its minorities. Of course, the Jewish minority being one of them, but not the only one. You had the Kurds, you had the Greeks, you had the Armenians, and a number of smaller ethnic groups. And he was very forcefully, in his writings and his speaking, in his work, promoting the idea of this inclusive polity, of this multicultural, pluralistic republic that he was hoping would emerge from the foundation of the republic. And unfortunately, as we know, that did not happen. So a few images to give you the flavor of the story. Here we go again. There was Paris. So here is Gad as he comes back, and he's donning a fez, which was the typical Ottoman Turkish headgear. He felt the need to kind of fit back into the picture once he'd settled back into Istanbul. here were the commando stairs in the street, the bank street. Next to these, God opened his law office, and it's still a very important part of downtown Istanbul today. Here is Gad with his son Emil, who would become a lawyer himself later on. And here are two images which I would like you to look at just because they bring another dimension to Gad and his family. They're in Wiesbaden. Here's Gad with his wife Elise. Here's Gad with his daughters who are rowing for pleasure, of course, on the Wiesbaden lake. And this is just to point out this, again, layered complexity of their identity, right? A little bit like my own. I'm born in Italy, but carry within myself all these different worlds. And there they were Jewish, they were Turkish, but ultimately they were extremely westernized, extremely connected to the French language and culture, spent years in Paris. The way of living, even at home, was extremely westernized. And in fact, they felt probably more comfortable, if not just as comfortable, whenever they were in a European place rather than when they were in Istanbul with all its difficulties. So this is something we may want to come back to, this ambiguity, if you will, of working in favor of this construction of the Turkish Republic and its identity, and at the same time maintaining a private life which was much more cosmopolitan, if you will, than anything else. So I thought it's something that's worth reflecting about. So what comes next? Well, what comes next is the tragic part of the story. In fact, after these 2 decades that are described as, pretty successful, where he was a respected jurist, a wealthy lawyer, and so on, then comes the Second World War. And we all know the horrors that that meant for everybody, especially for the Jews, sadly. Turkey remained neutral during the Second World War, however, ultimately much closer to the Nazis than to the Allies, right? And in fact, in 1942, the government of the time decided to enact a brutal piece of legislation, which was called the Varlık Vergisi, the wealth tax law, and basically decided to expropriate the wealth of the minorities, trying to, quote unquote, Turkify the economy and replenish the state's coffers that had been badly hit by the war economy. And so from one day to the next, this law comes out, lists are made of all the wealthy minority members, Jews, Armenians, and Greeks, who have to pay enormous sums of money, and they're given 15 days to pay. And if they don't pay within the 15 days, they're sent off to labor camp in the middle of Anatolia. So this is an absolutely shocking decision that the government took, and that first and foremost, God took in juridical terms, saying this is unacceptable. It's a medieval law. This is, and he went to the prime minister, who had been his student when God used to be a teacher of French in Izmir at the Lycée, and said, what is this? How can you do this? You have to repeal this measure right away. You're not respecting the Constitution. So here was this Jewish lawyer who was obviously one of the targets of the law, but rebelling even before trying to defend his own interests and preserve his own destiny. First and foremost, reacting as to the violation of the rule of law and the Constitution that was going on. And then, of course, there he was on the list. He was given 15 days. There was no way he could pay, although he was a wealthy man and owned a number of buildings, and I'll show you some photos to that effect. There he was, expropriated of all his belongings, and sent off to labor camp in Anatolia. This was a totally devastating blow to everything he had been, and believed in all his life. And in addition to finding himself pauper and barely surviving labor camp, he was an elderly gentleman by then, suffered enormously physically, but the moral impact of this betrayal of the rule of law by the Republic was probably the worst thing for him, and very painful to endure. He was in labor camp, fortunately, only for a few months. He lost 30 kilos, but he was there. He came back barely alive, went straight to hospital. But most than anything, he was morally crushed, and that was really the terrible thing for him. The persecution continued. He was disbarred. He wanted to travel to Palestine, which was then under British mandate, and he was forbidden from doing so. He was not given a passport, being told, "Oh, you're a threat to the Republic. We're not going to let you go." And so it was really, horrible time. But, for him, for a bunch of other minority members, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews alike, and of course for the families, and, the whole thing was kind of falling apart. So let me show you a few photos of those times. Yeah, so this is the kind of atmosphere and propaganda against the Jews. Here's Gad in his lawyer's robes, pretty much at the end of the 30s or early 40s, before, the world came crashing down. Here's the building that Gad had bought from the Decamondos, this family of important Jewish bankers, right next to those stairs I showed you a little bit earlier. This is the building that eventually was sold for a pittance while he was in labor camp, and that enabled his release from labor camp. And this is the kind of spoliation that was happening during those terrible days of the Verlik, whereby not only the real assets were confiscated, but as in Gad's case, they would go into people's apartments and take everything out, which happened to Gad and his family. And carpets and paintings and silverware and books, everything would go on the pavement, and there would be an auction. And this is not Gad's carpet, but it's that kind of thing that he and his family experienced in 1942, 1943, which was pretty terrible. Here are, and this is a photo of the times, here's the convoy of which Gad was part. They're walking through the snow to their labor camp as they got off the train. And here is Gad, number 2 in the photo, with another Jewish lawyer, number 1 in the photo, and some prison guards as they were. And you can see Gad holding a shovel, right, with which they would be asked to shovel snow in the winter, 2,000-meter altitude. So pretty brutal and pretty devastating. Those were really terrible times. So what happened, right? How could all this world come crashing, falling apart that quickly? So theme number 5 is Republican ethno-nationalism. And this is something against which the Jews had to struggle for 20 years before everything fell apart, from the foundation of the Republic in 1923 to 1943, when this Verlik happened and deportations and so on. So ultimately, Atatürk, who started with these lofty liberal principles of creating a republic equal to all, and where the Constitution was saying that everybody was equal in front of the law, so on and so forth, in fact, created a nation, recompacted the Turkish nation around its ethnicity. So its language, first of all. So Turkish as a language was revived, rewritten with different characters, cleaned up of its Arabic influences and so on. And there was a huge campaign to speak Turkish. And of course, what were the Jews speaking? were speaking either Ladino or they were speaking French, but they didn't speak Turkish. So this really put them at odds against the majority population and against the government. Ethno-nationalism was also based on the origins of the Turkish people from Central Asia, with the myths that went around, that went along with that identity. There was a propaganda machine to ultimately replace Islam that had been the glue holding Turkish society together for centuries with something different. And this something different was this intense nationalistic ideology, which obviously made it so that whoever was not Turkish, was not speaking Turkish, was not ethnically Turkish, hence, brackets, a Sunni Muslim, was not considered a real Turk. So this excluded from the polity all the minorities. Again, I want this to be very clear about this. This is not anti-Semitism, right? This is anti-minority politics, which is quite different, because the same kind of discrimination and punishment was inflicted upon the Jews as well as upon the Greeks and upon the Armenians. And so this is really something that was very, very difficult, impossible for the Jews to deal with, right? First, their schools and institutions were shut down in the 1920s because they were using French in those schools, and French was considered foreign language that couldn't be taught. So they were asked to teach in Hebrew, but the Jews of Turkey did not speak Hebrew and had never spoken Hebrew, had spoken Ladino or French, so that was out of the question. There was a regional pogrom in Thrace, a northern region of Turkey, in 1934. There were labor battalions in 1941 where minority members were all corralled into these military battalions, unarmed military battalions, and made to work, carry out civil works and so on. And then finally, the repressive law of 1942, the verdict that you see that I mentioned. So to wrap up, because I've taken quite a lot of time, what happened after that? God had another 10 years of his life, but these 10 years were years of suffering, of somehow living with the aftermath of this catastrophic event that occurred to him and to his family. Lots of family members left, went abroad, including my mother, who married my father, moved to Cairo. He was living pretty miserably. His son Emil, who, as I said, was also trained as a lawyer, came back from Palestine, where he spent a couple of years, picked up little by little the legal firm, and was able to make ends meet. His brother Marcel, whom he loved very much, also left for the States and became a successful businessman, but was actually helping in the form of loans and asking for interest payments, which is also very painful to endure. So there were really very, very difficult years that Gad went through. He was ill. I had been born in Rome, meanwhile, and he wanted to come and visit, but couldn't because he was too sick to do that. And finally, he passed away in 1954 and was mourned by the Jewish community. So a few images here too. So this is Emil in Tel Aviv in 1944 with his wife, Jenny Capuano, a doctor also from Istanbul, before he returned to Istanbul. And these are the three Franco brothers, Levi on the left of the photo, unless you see it upside down, I'm not sure. The one with the glasses anyway. So he had moved to Paris in 1920, had stayed there. The one in the middle is Marcel, this younger brother, and here is Gad on the right of the photo. And they met there to try to see if there was any way of fixing the finances and all these debts that Gad had and couldn't get rid of. And it's really the last time that the three met, and it wasn't from what I have read and written. And it wasn't an easy meeting. And finally, here is Gad's tomb in the Jewish cemetery of Arnavut Köy when he passed away in 1954. So what else to say? What happened to the Jews of Turkey at that point? In 1950, this single-party autocratic regime of Ataturk and company collapsed. Turkey had entered the sphere of the US after the Second World War. Multi-party democracy arrived in Turkey, but the Jews of Turkey, as soon as they got a chance, decided to get out. Ultimately, what they had endured, the disappointments, the betrayals, the ill treatments that they had endured to such an extent under the autocratic Ataturk regime was so harsh on them and so unbearable that as soon as they could, they left. And not everybody, of course, but again, about half of the community, of the Turkish community between 1948 and early 50s left for Israel, Palestine, mandate Palestine first, and Israel then. And yes, of course, some of them may have been Zionists, but ultimately it was the disappointment, the failure, the rejection that they had experienced in Turkey that drove them away. And so that is really the end of the story. The only one last point I'll make very quickly, I'm looking at my watch as we go ahead, is that Gad was obviously a very motivated intellectual, decided to write an article in 1950, which he titled Mea Culpa, My Fault. And it's really a very interesting piece to read. It's about 3 pages long, and you find it in the book if you get to read it, where he kind of looks back at the 50 years of his attempts at helping build an inclusive, tolerant society in Turkey, where the Jews would have been fully accepted as citizens, and realizing that he had failed, that ultimately this whole attempt had been a disaster. There he was a broken man with disasters. He had endured, half of the community had left. And of course, there was the enormous impact of what the Second World War and the Holocaust had meant for the entire Jewish community. And so he now looked upon the state of Israel as really as he said, the best protection against racial and religious discrimination. And while still professing his belief in the Jewish diaspora that could fight for the principle of equality of rights in every country. But so there was a big turnaround, if you will. And one of my reviewers, actually a Turkish professor, said, well, he went from being a Sephardi Turkish patriot to a repentant Zionist. And in a way, that's the moral of the story. So I'll stop there, Dora. I'm ready to have you lead the questions and answer session. I hope I didn't take too long and that you enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It was wonderful to listen to the story again, and I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'm sure they learned a lot. And we hope that many of you will feel like reading the book after getting a little taste of what the story is about. Of course, tomorrow we will send a follow-up email in which we will share with you also this recording and also the link where you can purchase the book. And also we will share with you, we will have a talk coming up about the Jews of Istanbul, which will be more also focusing on the history, but also sharing a bit of what is Jewish life in Istanbul today. We will share with you also the link for that. I'm going to read some comments and questions that came in throughout the talk. So I'll read a comment from Daisy. I'm just looking for it. Daisy Braverman shared with us that she's the stepdaughter of Leon Franco, and she was friendly with Daisy Franco and visited your parents in Italy. It's nice to meet you, she says.
Very much.
So she is saying hello. And I'll read a comment from Rachel. She says, my father was born in Izmir, Smyrna in 1890. He also was originally against Zionism, maybe because he read Fresco's El Tiempo. I also first heard Gad Franco's name from him. A few years ago, I read Rifat Bali's book in Turkish about Gad Franco. I also remember the effects of the Varlik text, but never knew anyone who had sacrificed so much for his country and worked so hard for it as Gad Franco, who was ruined by the tax. And and also a question from Rachel, isn't it true that Gad had also worked with Ataturk himself?
So to that point, there was a family myth which was running on for decades that actually Gad had been somehow one of the authors of the Turkish constitution. And that, I think, is what I said before. It's a myth. I don't think that it happened. What is true, though, is that, and I think that Gad knew his limits. He knew that as a Jew, he could not be part of that core group of jurists who were sitting in Ankara drafting the laws, and first of all wrote the Constitution in 1924, and then kept on generating this new set of modern laws that really brought Turkey into the 20th century and connected it to Western civilization, as it were, or at least it looked as if it was going that way. But what is true is that Gad was extremely influential in terms of the juridical thinking through his journal, through the contacts that he had back in Paris with important men of law. And so his voice, his opinions that he would manifest through not only his journal editorials, but also articles in the press all the time, Turkish press that was read by everybody, as it were, not only the Francophone press or the Ladino press that was still in existence. So he was a very, very powerful voice, and a voice, as I said, of liberalism and of constitutional integrity. That is very much true. And in that sense, and I know that he did, and I say so in the book, he met Ataturk a number of times. But yes, he was not an author of the Turkish constitution.
Thank you. If anyone else has questions, we have a couple more minutes to ask Anthony about what you're interested in. We had a lot of comments. You can also check them. People sharing that they also have family heritage in Turkey, and also thanking you for sharing this history. And someone is already saying that Ruth is saying that she needs to read the book, and hopefully a lot of other people are going to now be interested to read the details, because there's so much more to the whole story. So I don't see now more questions. I think you did a wonderful job in giving a background to the story.
Thank you.
I do want to mention one thing, if that's okay. So thank you, first of all. This was really a great talk after having read the book, and so it's very helpful. Thank you. I thought it was interesting that he started off being very into Jewish unity and coming together. You wrote that in his first article, he argued that if Jewish solidarity existed as it could and should, there would not be any part of the world, any persecuted Jew, nobody could easily allow himself to insult the Jewish name. And I just thought that's so powerful today in terms of what we're dealing with and what he ended up dealing with also, even just the different Jews throughout Turkey. So I don't know if that's a comment or a question, or you want to say anything. The concept of unity and diversity.
Very nice to see you on screen. I also thought it was a very powerful statement, and thinking that he was only 20 when he wrote that, it showed not only a very inspired person, but also somebody who knew enough about what was going on across the world, right? And that's really thanks to his reading, thanks to the fact that in Izmir you could get, papers from all over the world that were coming in on the ships, and there was a local press which is in Greek, in Turkish, in Ladino, and in French, of course. So somehow in this backward place, Turkey 100 years ago, there were thriving intellectuals, and God certainly emerged out of nowhere, out of little provincial town, thanks to his motivation, his intelligence, and his moral backbone, I would say. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Well, I really thank you all. I see a hand is up. I don't know if Dora.
Yes. So yeah, thank you, Dora, so much for opening up your mic. And now I'll just take the chance because maybe some of you have seen that we are doing these book events in partnership with Unity Through Diversity. So Dora will be joining us. She's the leader of this project. So she will be joining us in some of the future book events as well. Yes, so Holly's hand is up. I will pass the word to her. That will be the last question for today. You need to unmute, Holly. We cannot hear you.
Okay. Anthony, this is Holly from Kenosha, Wisconsin. I am more than privileged to see your talk again, having seen it on Harif with Lynn and Lawrence Julius a few weeks ago, as you know. And I want you to know that I remembered all the pictures that you were showing again, and it was like coming home again for me. I'm of a Russian Ashkenazic background, but your grandpa's story is very compelling, and it must be told. And I'm glad that I had the privilege to be able to see you again, to listen to the story. And I just want to ask you, then, did you ever get to see Grandpa, Gad, or no?
No, unfortunately not. You know, I was born 3 years before he passed away.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And my mother refused to go back to Istanbul at that time. And he wanted to come, but he was too sick to actually make the trip.
Yeah.
So he had photos of me that he was showing his visitors, and one of which I actually put in the book. But we never actually got to see each other. I found telegrams and letters that he and my grandmother wrote to me as a baby and so on, but it was all things that I kind of rediscovered much later on, nothing at the time.
Your grandpa is in your heart, and he is in all of our hearts, Anthony.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to hear that. Thank you all for listening. I would love to catch what was said in the chat, but of course I was too busy talking to you all, so I couldn't even go and open it.
We will send it to you, don't worry.
That'd be really
so thank you so much, Anthony, one more time, and thank you everyone for being here today. As I told you earlier, we will be in touch tomorrow, so you will receive the link both to the recording and also where to buy the book. So thank you everyone, and we wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. Same to you.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Stay
so
well,
much.
everybody.
Thank you.